Welcome to Candlewick Library. I'm Cheryl. Today I'm sharing a wrap up of the books I read in November and December. So in November, I finished Heroes of History, Captain John Smith, A Foothold in the New World by Janet and Jeff Benji, whatever their last name is. And I read that aloud with my daughter in homeschool. We started that actually in October and then finished it in November. And that I loved. It was one of my favorite books of the Heroes of History group of books. My only point of reference before that for John Smith was knowing about Jamestown, having visited Jamestown, and also his connection to Pocahontas. But I knew that a lot of the story of Pocahontas is fictional, and so I didn't really know how much of his story that I had heard before was fact. And so reading a book about his life was incredible. The Pocahontas part of it is such a small part of his life, and he had so many adventures. I do not understand how no one has made a movie about his life from beginning to end. There's so many stories in there that were just incredible. I mean, he'd been through more by the time he was 30 than just about anybody else in their whole lifetime. Then I read Sparkling Cyanide by Agatha Christie. That one was the best one I had read for a while at that point, because this year I found that with the Agatha Christie books I was reading, since so many of them were books I hadn't read yet, they were more obscure ones, and I found that I wasn't enjoying a lot of them as much as some of the more well-known ones. But that one really stood out. I really liked it. I thought for sure I was right about what was happening in that book. I mean, I always do with hers, and then I get, I was wrong. But this one, I was certain that I was right, and then I was completely wrong. It was going back and forth between all the different characters, getting all of their perspectives. It was a really fun mystery. I really liked that one. And then I started to read A Murder is Announced by her, but then I realized I know this story. And so I went back and looked on, I think it was on Goodreads or something, and I had put it as read. So I don't know. I think it was just because I didn't own it that I didn't think I'd read it. I'm not sure. But I just decided I wasn't going to finish it because I already knew the story and I had other things I wanted to get to. I wasn't reading as much in November and December as I normally do. So I decided not to take the time on that. Then I read They Came to Baghdad, also by Agatha Christie. This one became one of my favorites. It reminded me a lot of The Man in the Brown Suit, which is my very favorite Agatha Christie, which is funny because I have heard a lot of people say they don't like it, but I love it. It's more of an adventure story than a murder mystery, I think. And this one was the same. It felt more like an adventure story. I thought it was great. I thought the characters were really interesting and the mystery itself was fun. It was really hard to know who was on the right side and who was on the wrong side, and I guessed wrong and right on some of them. I ended up liking that one even more than Sparkling Cyanide. And then I started Destination Unknown. It sounds really good, but I could not get into it. And so that one I decided to DNF, and just maybe at some point I will get back to it. And then we finished Cold Case Christianity. We were reading that as a family for the last few months, and I thought that was really good. A criminal homicide detective, and he went at the Bible, at the Gospels in particular, using all of the same tools he used in his homicide investigations. And I thought that was a really interesting book, and I really enjoyed reading it with my family. It brought up a lot of discussions throughout the few months that we were reading it. Then I read Squanto, Friend of the Pilgrims by Clyde Robert Bulla. We read this for school many, many years ago, and so I read it with my youngest daughter again, and it was not as good as I remembered it being. Having just finished the book about John Smith, there were things in it that were not accurate, and so then I went on a deep dive online looking up information to try to figure out, well, wait, which one is accurate? And I found that the one about John Smith that I love so much seemed to be more accurate, and that the Squanto one tended to be a little bit more sanitized. Some of it was information that was like, we don't know for sure, but this is what most people believe. And the Squanto was going with what might have been, but not everybody was agreed on. It was still a decent book. It was a little bit on the young side, but I would definitely not recommend it unless your kids were really young, because they might not be ready for the more detailed book. And then in December, I read Christmas with the Queen by Hazel Gaynor and Heather Webb. That was with my mom for Inklings. And I really liked it. It was telling the story of this woman who is a single mom, and she meets back up with someone she had been in love with years earlier, and his wife has just died. And at first I wasn't thinking I was going to like it, because I thought, well, if his wife just died, let's not have a romance between these two, please. But then it dragged on, and it went over many years. And so I was glad that there were years for them to get to know each other better and to, get out further from his wife's death. but then it felt like it was going on too long. So somewhere in the middle would have been a little bit better, but I did like the story, and their writing is good. They write very seamlessly together. When they're writing a book together, I never can tell that it's a different writer for different chapters. I did enjoy it. And then I finished the biography I was reading all year long called Agatha Christie, An Elusive Woman by Lucy Worsley. That one was long, maybe a bit too long unless you wanted to know every single detail about Agatha and everyone around her. But the first half I felt like was especially interesting. The second half dragged on a little bit. If she was my absolute favorite author, I probably would have just loved every word of the book. But I really like Agatha Christie, but she's not my favorite. It was very well done, very well written, and I thought it was very good. So if you want to read more about her, know more about her, I would definitely recommend it. However, it does spoil almost all of her books. I mean, it spoils a lot of her books. And it will just talk about a book, and it will just say what happened in it. So I think it's better to read if you don't care about getting spoiled, or if you have read all of her books or most of her books, then you can, because that is what I found as I started to read it at the beginning of the year, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is spoiling books. So I stopped, and then I went back to it at the end of the year after I had read the majority of them, and I still was spoiled on a few that I hadn't read. Then I read The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side by Agatha Christie. As you can see with my Agatha Christie project, there were quite a few months when I did not read anything by her, so I was very heavy in her books in November and December. So Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, it started out great. It's Miss Marple one, and I like her, but I don't like her as much as Poirot. So I wasn't sure how much I would like it. I did like the story, and I found the ending pretty surprising, but I felt like it was twice as long as it needed to be. And I don't often feel that way with her books. I feel like they move really fast and that there's only what needs to be said. But this one, I felt like there was more than needed to be there, especially for how the book ended without giving anything away. It was not a favorite, but I still thought it was pretty good. And then I read The Witness for the Prosecution by her. This was a collection of short stories. There was a Marple one, there was a Poirot one, and then other random ones. Some weren't as good as others. There were a few that I really liked, and overall I thought it was a really good collection of short stories. And in fact, I think I liked it better than any of the other collections of short stories I've read by her. And I felt like it was a really good choice for the last book in the project, since it did have so many of the different characters coming back in it. After that, I read Through Each Tomorrow by Gabrielle Meyer. That was the newest book in the Timeless series that just came out in November, and it was good in many ways, but it's been my least favorite so far. Mainly because I didn't care about the time periods as much as some of the other time periods in the other books. And I don't know if that was just because of the characters in it or if I just wasn't getting into them. I'm not sure. There were main characters, and then there were the characters that were side characters with each main character, and I liked the side characters better, and I think that was where the biggest disconnect came from me. I wished that it had been through a different person's viewpoint. I did like the ending and the connections it had to earlier books. Enjoyed it, but it was my least favorite. And then I read The Sherlock Society #2. This is by James Ponti. This one was called Hurricane Heist. He's one of my favorite middle grade authors, and this is a book of kids that are really into Sherlock Holmes, and they try to solve mysteries. And the first one I thought was really good, but the second one I liked even better. It was a very solid story. It took a while to take off and get going into the mystery itself, because it was first talking a lot about what had happened in the last book, because the kids were about to start school, and one kid was worried that that meant that they wouldn't be hanging out as much, stuff like that. But it did a really good job of showing the investigation process in this one, and the process of eliminating suspects, and also the reality of the statute of limitations. So I think kids could learn a lot about real investigations from it, and it was a fun story. I also read a book that totally surprised me that I even read it, but it was one that was recommended by a few people, so I decided to read Open Book by Jessica Simpson. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, when Britney Spears and all of them were coming out, I actually liked Jessica Simpson the most. I liked her voice the most at the time. Living through that time when all of them were big and there was the reality show and all that with her, I wasn't sure what I would be getting into with this book, but it was recommended so highly that I decided to give it a shot. And it was a really interesting memoir. She is, I think, way more open than most celebrities are in their memoirs. It's so startling to see how little confidence she had. You see some celebrities in really bad lights because she says who it is and she says what they've done. But then you also see the kindness of some of them, like Dolly Parton. And I enjoyed it. I was really glad I read it. It was very interesting. Then I read The Bell Tolls at Traeger Hall by Jamie Jo Wright. And that one was good, but I did feel like it was a little bit too long and repetitive in comparison to some of her other books. And then the last book of the year for me was the reread of Rilla of Ingleside by Ellen Montgomery. It's the last book in the Anne of Green Gables series. And I was going to read that in November, but I pushed it off till December. And I was so glad that I ended the year with that book because I love it so much. Anne of Green Gables is my favorite book, and I love the whole series. But I've talked before about how Anne of Green Gables, Anne's House of Dreams, and Rilla of Ingleside are my 3 favorite books in the series. But Rilla of Ingleside really is probably my second favorite, right under Anne of Green Gables. So I feel like her first and the last book in the series are the strongest. It is so wonderful and beautiful, and it makes me cry. Rilla is Anne's daughter, and she starts out as kind of a spoiled young girl, just a little bit shallow in some ways, but throughout the book you see such amazing character growth from her. Having read Lucy Maud Montgomery's journals, I know how hard World War I was for her, and the kind of journal entries she was writing during that time about the horrific nature of what was happening, all of the young men that were dying, and just it really affected her. And so you can see that in this book. She puts all of that into this book, and you go through it with the characters. I just love it. And so I definitely recommend, if you've ever read Anne of Green Gables, to read the whole series. And if you can't get through the middle ones, just skip to the end and read the last one. They should have made a movie about this one. The third Anne of Green Gables movie should not have been the one that it was. It should have been Anne and Gilbert older with their kids. It should have been Rilla with her war baby and telling her story. I will always say that. Those are all the books I read in November and December. My favorite book, of course, was Rilla of Ingleside, but as I've said before, I usually try to pick a book that isn't a reread for my favorite of the month. So other than that, it probably was Sherlock Society, just because I had so much fun with that book in particular. In November, my favorite book was the John Smith one.